Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning into The Social Mind. Today, our topic for discussion is Death and Food, the evolution of happy hour in Grenada. The loss of a loved one is always hard to come to terms with. While death is universal, different cultures and different societies have diverse ways of mourning the loss of a loved one. Furthermore, depending on one's religious beliefs and cultural traditions, funeral rituals different when mourning, celebrating, or honoring the passing of a loved one. For instance, in some parts of the world, there are some cultures that have specific burial rituals, and in some societies, they have specific bereavement rituals. In the Jewish culture, for example, close family members or immediate family members would tear a piece of clothing that symbolized the loss and grief they're experiencing due to the passing of their loved one. In Hong Kong, due to the country being heavily populated and there's limited space for burials, families in that society cremate and scatter their loved ones at sea because it's also seen as tabooed to bring the ashes back to the home or residence. Now, growing up in Grenada, I remembered the sounding or the ringing of the church bells whenever a funeral occurred. However, I never really paid attention or made any sense of it, but as I got older and started to experience different cultures and how they honor the passing of their loved ones, the ringing of the bell made sense to me. In some societies, the ringing of the bell, how many times, and the length of how the length of time, the bell is rung, is also another ritual. Dancing with the dead is another ritual in Madagascar, which happens 5 to 7 years after the initial burial of a loved one. The family loved ones would unearth the body of the dead or exhume it. This allows the family to strip the burial clothing and place their loved ones in fresh coverings. Then there is a replacement ceremony. Then there is a placement ceremony that takes place to seal the crypt or the tomb for another 5 to 7 years. This practice is known as turning of the bones or dancing with the dead. Hanging coffins. In the northern area of the Philippines, a common death ritual is to carve a beautiful coffin or casket, then place the coffin or casket on the side of a cliff for burial. Before the loved one is placed in the casket, family members participate in certain ceremonies, such as seating the person in a death chair and covering them with a blanket. In New Orleans, there's a blend of African and European cultures which brought the jazz funeral tradition to Louisiana. When the funeral processions happen, live musicians walk and play instruments, often sad songs at the beginning. After the burial, a post-funeral party happens with lively, merry music in celebration of the person's life. In contemporary Grenada, there is a similar trend called happy hour, where after the burial of a loved one, there is refreshment served at the residence of the deceased or in a designated place or area. Today, we are going to talk about death and food, the evolution of happy hour in Grenada. Welcome, Dr. Crawford-Daniel, to The Social Mind. Dr. Crawford-Daniel is a professor of sociology and a researcher at St. George's University. Crawford-Daniel has served as a principal investigator for several local, regional, and international consultationships, including drafting the policy of aging and Grenada standards for residential homes for older people. Other major projects she undertook include Grenada Participatory Poverty Assessment, Juvenile Justice, Grenada Census Report, Drugs and Crime in the OECS, Disaster Preparedness, Planning for Persons with Disabilities, among others. She's also the author of 2 books, Unveiling Island Passion and Sun Rising. Dr. Crawford-Daniel, welcome. Finally, you have made it to the social mind. Is there anything that I would have mentioned that you want to tell the audience about yourself? Are we good?
No, I think you covered it all. My entire decades of life in one paragraph, so that's fine.
Lovely. So, as I mentioned, guys, we're going to be talking about death and food, the evolution of happy hour in Grenada. Dr. Crawford, how can we explain this new cultural development in the Grenadian context, and what does that mean for us culturally?
Lauderdale, first, I want to say thank you for inviting me to the Social Mind. I think these are conversations that are very much overdue. And I want to congratulate you for that initiative. I think it's really good. And thanks again for inviting me. I was wondering why you invite me to speak on something so morbid as death and dying and happy hour and so, but I do understand that it is an important part of life and living, and as a sociologist, it is certainly an area of life that we cover, death, right, and bereavement. So, as you rightly said, historically, death and dying or bereavement has always been with us, and different cultures have different approaches to both death, dying, and bereavement. And so I know your interest is in happy hour, and in order for me to treat happy hour the way that I really should treat it, I think we need first to go back historically and look at the evolution of death in Grenada, or evolution of the attitude towards death in Grenada, and the evolution of the attitude towards bereavement or grief, right? And today we are seeing something differently than what existed in the past.
And what I grew up with, I'm sure it's the same for you, correct? Because what you grew up with and I grew up with, that's not what I knew in the past. So that's why it's sort of a fascinating phenomenon for me.
So I'll try to go back fairly, right. So I'm going to try to go back fairly early. This evolution I'm speaking about is that we saw in the past a sort of mourning of the dead. And we see that evolutionary change to which we have today that we call celebration of the life of the deceased. And that celebration is manifested in many ways. And in Grenada in particular, the evolution of this thing that we call happy hour. But Grenada is an interesting case. I would say that we have historically a fascination and a sort of intimacy with death. And it's ironic because in addition to that fascination and intimacy that we have with death, we also have a sort of fear of death, a sort of apprehension towards death, a sort of, a fear that may be bred out of uncertainty, not sure or not aware as to what really death is and so. So this fascination and intimacy that we would have had about death in the past, the sort of intimate relationship that we had with death prior to current period, prior to contemporary times, death took place in the homes. People had intimacy with death because the sick were kept in the home. People died at home. Preparation of the dead body was done at home. The dead was kept in ice boxes in the homes where, the children, the parents, everyone had that sort of intimate closeness to death. So prior to a number of things that evolve and develop over the period, things like refrigeration, things as the establishment of funeral homes, things like electrification and embalming technology, all of these, radio and television announcement of death and public ceremonies and all of that. In the past, that was not the situation. And because most of the things happened at home and in the community, from the announcement of the dead, because I think in the past, they would have some individual in the community go around, ring a bell, announce the death, and there was this patois word, I think, that was spoken at the time, Sakitan Pali Lot or something like that. Whoever here passed it on. So there was no television announcement. Yeah. So there were no television announcement. There were no what we know today. And that situation, we, as with every culture, every society, and if you understand and you look at how society evolve and develop, things change over time. So by the time our generation came around, much of that practice had ended in the form that it was known at the time. In fact, in those days when someone died, the women will dress the dead in the home. The women will make wreaths out of, go around in the community, get flowers. The men will go into the forest or the woods and cut the trees and come home and build the coffin. The community will bring every possible thing that they would have for the family. So in other words, there was no expense to the family. The family were taken care of. The family were embraced, held in a particular way by the community, taken care of. So the emotional and psychological and any type of pain or hurt of grief was shared. And when grief and pain and hurt is shared by the community, it lessens. And so that situation is very different today with the commercialization of funeral, even the commercialization of bereavement. So when we look at in the past, when, for example, a major part of death and burial in the past was the praise or the third night wake, some people call it, that was an activity that dealt with help the grieving family overcome their grief. It showed communities' interest in what they were going through, and so the community will provide the eats. They're going to bring the bakes and the saltfish and the cocoa tea and the coffee. The family had no expenses. The family had no expenses for coffin. The family had no expenses for fancy outfit to bury the dead. People were buried in family lots or plots, right? There was no public burial in any major way. And so the cost of burial was very minuscule. In fact, the family quite often did not have to. But what we have seen today is a sort of evolution where everything has become commercialized. With the advent of the funeral home, the dead is we're no longer intimate with the dead, and that may add to the sort of fear and lack of understanding of death. Because now people die in the hospital. When they die, they're taken either to the morgue or the funeral home. When that happens, the dressing of the dead is done there. You're to purchase the flowers from everything is done now in the funeral home. And so that intimacy that I spoke about, that we had with the dead in the past, that intimacy is now lost. And so it has created a sense, death has evolved into a sort of fearful sense and awe. People are are struck about death. And so when we think about what death and bereavement, and that is the grieving period, what we did in the past, what was done when someone died in the past, and how the community came together to assist with with the grieving, that took charge of everything, took charge of the family, held them in their arms, consoled them, and gave them hope with the understanding that life have to continue and that they are going to take care of their interests no matter which member of the family would have passed away. They are going to look out for them for as long as they would need that type of support. So when you think about how things have evolved, so we moved from a situation of where we were intimate with death, the dead were kept at home. Now people die in the hospital, they take them straight to the morgue or the funeral home. So we have lost that level of intimacy with death, and that may increase the fear that ensued, that followed. But what we have seen in the more past 2 or 3 decades has been something that we call, that you refer to as happy hour, others refer to it as happy hour. And people have mixed kind of attitude towards happy hour. But we must understand that the hurt and the grief that people feel when there is a death, people use different forms of getting over and understanding that life must continue. And for some people, it is easier, and it is, some people feel very numb when a death occurs. They feel hopeless. They feel that's it. But the happy hour to me serve a major purpose for some persons, and that purpose have lots to do with that evolution I spoke of, in moving away from mourning of a dead to one of celebrating the life. So it's an opportunity to share. And what do we share? We share tributes about the dead. We say all of the nice things that we can remember. Everyone have to be seen at the funeral or want to go and pay some form of tribute to the family. So that type of situation and evolved, it's more as celebratory. In the past, it was more mournful, it was sad, it's stoic, it was, but now we are seeing a more festive sort of approach and attitude towards funeral, towards death. And I think that have much to do with that evolution, and now understanding, a greater understanding that death is a natural part of life. And that, as you said earlier, we all have to go that direction. So as a younger and younger generation, as they grow up in this society, what they are going to be seeing more is that celebration of a life, and not so much the mourning of the dead as we would have done. So the happy hour do have a very helpful purpose or function with regards to mourning. It helped to numb the grief, numb the sadness, and it helped the family to forget for a while the loss, and to help them to bring them to terms, let them understand that life have to go on, life have to continue. And so you do give the family an opportunity to grieve and to mourn, but that is a way of sort of uplifting them. So while some are not in very much agreement with happy hour, others are. And I think that we have to understand that people will use different ways of getting over crisis, and for some that is their way of getting rid of that numb feeling that is brought on by a death.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Crawford, for that explanation. However, I think there's a flip side to that. You say the families are celebrating, because you said in the past there was intimacy in that the community took care of everything when there was a death in a family. So there was that community life. It took a village to raise a child. I suppose it take a village to care for that family when they have the loss of a loved one. That's what you're saying, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
However, the flip side of that, one can argue in recent times also, because we have become so individualistic that yes, the community is no longer involved, but even within families, there is that conflict when there's a death of a loved one. That conflict in the sense that nobody, particularly for poor families, nobody, while we know death is certain, we just don't know when. Not all families are able to prepare for that financially. So when it comes to that aspect of preparing for the departure of that loved one financially, families are sometimes, there's a conflict that sometimes occurs. However, what I've seen, when that conflict, nobody really has the money for the actual burial and go through the different processes. But once the body is in the ground, for some reason there's funds put aside for that happy hour. So you didn't celebrate them per se. Some people die alone, as you say, in their homes, and then they're just taken to the morgue. Then there's the preparation for the departure. So they didn't probably get that attention that the community gave in the past, and they die alone. But there's a celebration. What are we then celebrating? I know I probably strayed from the point because I really want to get down to understanding
right on target.
that's happy hour. What are we celebrating when that person was alive? They were alone. You might have put them in a home, right? You might have put them in a home. What are we celebrating? We celebrating that we no longer have to worry about them. What is it that we celebrating? So for me, the idea of happy hour is sometimes conflicting. I understand if you're there for your families all the time and you want, some people kind of say how they want to be, how they want to go away, what they want to happen when they die, the different rituals and rites. Some families have that. But then, like I said, there's a flip side. What about those who didn't have that great life? But at the end of their life, family members put on this extravaganza. Party, music, food, drinks, and we call it a happy hour. I understand that rituals need to take place, but to me, there's a disconnect. Help me to, and I suppose the audience as well, help us to connect that.
I'm sure, and that's where the downside of the meaning of funeral, and especially in Grenada, I think Caribou might be a different type of experience that may still maintain much of that sort of original way of dealing with some death, and we could talk a little about that little later. But that is what, in the past, the family had no expenses. Little to no expenses. The community came together. But what, in the name of development, some of which I call the underdevelopment of development, what has happened is that the sort of community relations has grown further apart with all of the other distractions and other possibilities that people have. So in the past, families did not have any cost. Now, with happy hour and burial, the exorbitant cost, the families, many of them are forced sometimes to take loan or depending on relatives overseas to contribute. It is ridiculous in the sense that you're moving from a situation where the community came together to take care of the needs, and because of what we call development, right, we are advancing, and depending on all of the modern possibilities for everything now, is a major strain on families, for many families, especially that happy hour. Because you found when in the days of the praise or the wake or the 40 day, it was the community that brought the stuff for the so-called party or whatever social that was held then. But now the family have to put out every single thing, including buying wreath in many cases, right? In the past, that was, a natural task for the women in a particular community. Once someone died, a group of them will get together, collect flowers, and do wreath. And wreath is not cheap in Grenada. Then the party, the beers and the rum and the music that you have to get a set to play, and a space to have the party sometimes, because sometimes the home's not big enough for the happy hour.
Crowd.
All of
Mm-hmm.
that cost is currently borne by the family, in addition to the grief. And sometimes you see some family seem to be grieving extra in an extra way. It could be that financial burden that
The
is brought to
extra,
bear on them, having to prepare. The cost of the coffin alone is astronomical. um you are told you have to be buried in special outfits, and sometimes you have to go out and buy new outfits, or so it's a whole set of costs that has been thrust on people without little or no resistance. And so we see the demise of that sort of community bonding, community getting together, community approach towards death, dying, funeral, and bereavement. And so all of that is now commercialized and has brought some, astronomical cost to families. So you're talking sometimes 20,000, 15,000, and above that. And the thing is, in Grenada, there is a percept people would look to see what type of coffin that person burying, estimating the cost. So they have attached some meaningless, if you really think substantially, meaningless, attach some things to burial that is putting some people under pressure because they feel they have to respond to those types of pressures, that the coffin must be a special price and a special quality. Right? In the past, it was a box, roughly
I
hewn,
know.
but comfortably enough to fit the dead. So that is additional burden brought on top of the grief. And for many families, it is a stretch to get involved in all of this. And there seems to be a growing expectation for happy hour. Some people, they do not even go to the funeral. But the first
It just
question, where is the happy
where's
hour?
the happy hour?
So they bypass the funeral, they bypass the church or wherever the service is being held, and they head straight for the happy hour. And so we have even there are cases a lot in Grenada. A lot of people just feel they have to go to the funeral wherever it is, particularly if, for example, the funeral is a good distance away from the home or place
The
of
home.
residence. So
Yeah.
if there are funeral in Grenville or St. Patrick's or St. David's, people will leave work as a big
And hire a
line
bus.
to go to that
And hire a
funeral.
bus. Hire
Hire a
transportation to
bus.
get there.
And yeah, and sometimes they end up in a rum shop or somewhere close to the funeral, never hear a word or don't even know who the dead
The
is.
people. So
So it has become this line. But on the positive side, with the demise of the community life, it is a form of you get an opportunity to socialize. Because at funeral, everyone goes to funeral. Different age group, you name it, people go to funerals, and it's an opportunity to meet people, establish relationships at funeral. They meet partners at funeral, old friends at funeral, school friends. So there is that side to it, in the absence of what we knew as community before. This is one of the main or key activity in Grenada, where you get an opportunity to socialize and reconnect with old friends and meet new friends. And so I think that too could be a pull, right? Because we are social beings. We need to connect. We need relationships. We need to meet and greet each other and catch up. And so funeral offer that sort of opportunity. So despite the high cost of things and the difficulty, and a lot of employers complain that people go to funeral on average 1.8, I think that was the last statistics I saw, 1.8 funeral per week, which is almost, well, you could say 2 funeral per week, and so when you think about that side of it, it's sort of I'm not sure if it balances enough, but there is pressure on the family to provide. And then on the other side of the coin, there is an opportunity to reconnect with old friends and to, just For many people, it's a lime, it's a hang. And while it provides consolation to the family, because people like to see if they had a big funeral or a small funeral, people like to know others came out to bid farewell to their loved ones. So I find in Grenada, people love to know when they had a big funeral. The turnout was great. One of the first questions people ask, how was the turnout?
Oh,
Did a lot of people come, etc., etc. So it's not so much the mourning and the grieving and so of the past. That is done maybe even the church service. It's important for some people to be seen that they have actually attended the funeral. So the family members need to see that they are there. Lots of people go for things like communion, or they volunteer to hand out the pamphlets. They have to be seen at the funeral. They're expected to be seen. Even if it's just for 5 minutes, they can't stay, but they have to be seen at the funeral. And so all of these things become important to our people. And when it may look tacky, but when you think about it, is the absence of much community activities and community event that offer people that opportunity to be together. And when there's a crisis, as a death is, you find people like to come together, and it's emotionally and psychologically, it provides some useful function to people, both to the bereaved family and to the attendees. So while I understand the problem with the individualism and how now the family have to bear so much unnecessary costs sometimes, because people come to eat and drink and they're not, as in the past, providing anything for the wake. Some people still provide their stuff. They may bake and bring things for the family, etc. But for the happy hour, it's all the family's responsibility and costs. Right, so I guess the costs have to be looked at against the opportunity to socialize, to meet friends, to reconnect with old ones, to just old talk and connect. So that, I think, is an attraction of the funeral. So people are not going to funeral so much for the funeral's sake, but to connect with other people that they have not seen for a long time. So sometimes I look at it from that angle.
Okay, so as a society, how do we all understand? We know what grief is because we might have feel sad, we might have lost a loved one, you might have lost a pet. How do we understand grief from a cultural and socio-economic perspective in a Grenadian context? How do we understand that when there is a death of a loved one? How can we probably, I suppose, bridge some of the old, because that's what culture is, bridging the old with the new, right? So how can we use the intimacy of the community and help us to understand grief from a socio-cultural perspective, a socio-economic perspective? My final question.
Well, I think, as you said earlier, right? People, different cultures approach grief differently. Now, much have to do with our perception of if there is an afterlife. For some people, when you're dead, that's it. For other people, death is a continuation of life in a different form. And for other people, there is a special place for the dead, right? So there are different perceptions about and how people perceive after death, or afterlife, it's called, when someone dies, afterlife. Your perception of the afterlife have a lot to do with, or how you grieve have a lot to do with your perception about the afterlife. Let's look at, and this is a typical example of the Karakou situation. Now, Grenada is predominantly influenced by Christian, or let's say Western religions, right? So Christianity is practiced, and the type Christian burial is a norm in this society. But if you look at Grenada society, and particularly focusing on Karakou, and of course in other parts of Grenada, we have a sort of dual approach to just about everything. And that may have a lot to do with our history of enslavement enslaved people being brought to this part of the world. We have the indigenous people who had their own rituals and customs, and so as it relates to death, dying, funeral, and bereavement. And then we have a combination of all of these types of different approaches to death and belief systems about the afterlife, about death and life, etc. And much of our approach to grieving have a lot to do with our worldview or our perception or deep belief about death. So for those who, for example, look at the connection of our folks from Carriacou and many parts of Grenada too, that strong connection with our ancestors, this ancestral relationship. That for people, from many people from Carriacou, the ancestors are with them, the dead relatives and family are with them every day. They live with them, they feel their presence. So that is a belief. So they're looking over them, they're guiding them, they're directing their path, they're alerting them of problems, whether it's in dreams or visions or just intuition or, but there is that strong belief. So that is why you see, for example, in Carriacou, they have these offering of plates or the saraka or they may have different libation. A lot of attention is placed on the death, the dying, and the way they grieve and bereave, right? The tomb, the laying of the tomb. So, and all of these different events and activities that celebrated in Carriacou with regards to that. That is because there's a strong connection between the living and the ancestors, and the strong belief, a deep belief that the ancestors are always with them. So one can understand what mourning, because there is that belief that they're always there. So even though they're not physically with them, they are there. So the type of grief and bereavement that they demonstrate might be different from those who think when you're dead, you're done. When you're dead, you're done. There's no reason, you wouldn't be coming back, in other words. So, and then there are those who think they're going in a better place at some point after death. So all these different beliefs and views about death and dying dictate in a lot of ways what approaches that we take towards bereavement or grieving. All right. And so it have a lot to do with that understanding. Is it a Carriacou situation where the ancestor is always there? We may not be able to see or feel them, but we know they're there looking at us. So there is that sort of deep connection to ancestors. Many of us in Grenada misunderstand and say, oh, Carriacou people believe in Obia, they believe in this, they believe in that, because they do not have an understanding of the depth of the culture and the connection between the living and the dead in Carriacou, and the respect for the ancestors and the belief and knowledge that they're always there to guide and protect them. All right. So that have a lot to do. I mean, the grieving, because remember, those who are living have to continue to live. And so that grief, that breathing, that space for people to grieve is afforded the family so that they can come to terms with the death. It gives you enough time to come to terms with the death. But it also, with all of the prayers, whether it is in the form of prayers or dancing or food or celebration or whatever, but it is encouraging you that life, yes, we understand the loss. We are with you in this loss. We understand the depth of pain. We understand the hurt, but life have to continue. We have to continue. There's too many unknowns, right? So no one knows who is right in all of this. And so that is why in society or in life, it is not wise to compare cultures, but to respect, acknowledge, and respect other people's culture, because there are different belief systems, different worldview about just about everything. And death is one of the main differentiations in culture. What are the people's thoughts about death, how they perceive death to be, what they perceive happened to you after death? That is a major measure of various cultures. And so it is such a fascinating study to look at how different cultures treat it, as you said in the earlier section of your presentation, right? The Jews sitting in shivers, or as you said, holding a part of that person, clothing or something, to feel that level of closeness, the dancing with the dead in Madagascar, and all of these different types of rituals. This is a form of grieving, and it's an opportunity to express your grief. And so people have to be given the space to do that. And of course, in some cultures, it's very economically strenuous. In Grenada, if we think about happy hour, the growing concept of happy hour. So I guess I'm not sure how eventually it's gonna. I think it's here to stay, but it may just take different form as society evolve, of course, just as other cultures do, and things differ from culture to culture. So on that basis, I think I'm just thinking about death, dying, and bereavement. It's such a fascinating study, such an amazing thing, because we do not know whose practice is. There is no right or wrong. So I never look at culture from the point of view of right or wrong, but to appreciate and understand from the perspective of that culture why people believe or do certain things when they're dead, and what opportunities they need for grieving, the bereavement aspect of it. That's also important. So it's just very, very, very fascinating to me. So that's what I want to answer your final question.
My question. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Crawford. Your information was very, very informative. As we wrap up, guys, remember, culture embodies the social behavior found in all societies, as well as our knowledge, our beliefs, our rituals, our practices, our laws, our customs. They are passed down from one generation to the next. So as Dr. Crawford rightfully said, moving forward in the Grenadian context, in our modern Grenada, we can predict that happy hour is here to stay, right? Culture is what makes us do the things we do. Culture is what makes us behave the way that we behave. Culture is constantly evolving. So how we celebrate and acknowledge our festivals and our rituals, it may change over time. As Dr. Crawford said, culture is evolving. So once culture, our heritage, our identity, with the creolization of new culture and how it infuses into our celebrations and our cultural beliefs, there will be changes over time. Some may die, some new cultures will emerge. And as Dr. Crawford rightfully said, happy hour might be here to stay with a little twist in the not too distant future. Thank you for tuning in to The Social Mind, and I would see you next week.
Thank you very much. This was fun.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crawford.
Such a morbid topic, but it's a lot of fun. It's exciting.
It is discussions that we need to have so that as social scientists and as responsible citizens, we understand why other people are doing what they do. We understand and we respect them because we have tolerance towards the different things, the different rituals, the different belief that others have within our own society. As I mentioned on another program, in another show, we are more alike than we are different. Thank you again for being here, Dr. Crawford.
You're more than welcome. Anytime.